I thought executive functioning was a part of ADHD. I was really surprised, both back in 2005 and then in the latest issue of the DSM, to find that that's not the case.
There's more than just executive dysfunction going on with the ADHD thing. And maybe we need to be also supporting that other stuff.
It still blows my mind that we're having this conversation in 2020. Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be sitting down with Sarah and talking about executive functioning. We've done a lot of research for this. There's been a lot of papers, a lot of things that we've discussed. But executive functioning is a little bit more, I don't want to say controversial, but it's something that you think about potentially, or you might never have thought about, but like it has a big place in ADHD life, but not necessarily in ADHD discussion. And it's got a lot of controversy in it. So I'm excited to dive in today. How about you, Sarah?
Yeah, this topic is way juicier than I anticipated. Like I thought that executive functioning was sorted. But spoilers, it's not. It's not. There's still lots of conversations happening. So yeah, this is just one of probably many episodes on executive functioning in our future.
Yeah, I was ready to just give you the DSM definition of executive functioning, but they don't mention it by name in the DSM. So I just wanted to flag that right at the beginning. If you go into the DSM, which is what they use to diagnose people with ADHD, people mostly focus on this idea of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. That's kind of the main trifecta of ADHD, if you will. And then at the bottom of that, like all the way back, on page 2, they have a section for associated features. And they mention delays in language, motor skills, social development, and difficulty, what they call neurocognitive deficits that could include struggles with working memory, set shifting, reaction times, and a bunch of other things as well. So it's really not the high level conversation that I expected it to be, considering that the people that we work with, our clients, executive functioning is a big part of what we discuss because it's a big part of the struggles that we have.
Yeah, it's really surprising to see them talk about impulsivity as if it's related to executive functioning. Because when I think of impulsivity, I just think of like reactivity. But I guess if I sort of sit back and think about it, reacting without having time to really think, reacting without making sure I'm using my brilliant brain.
Yeah.
I can see how ADHDers might struggle with that.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, let's get into these papers because I'm really, really excited to chat about them. So I'm going to just go through the first paper. The first paper is actually not recent. I know most of our papers are usually recent, but this one is from 2000.
Old.
Yeah, we just decided to go way back for you guys.
It's important. We're establishing like historical record here.
Yes, we've decided we go back when we want to get a sense of what's going on. So this paper is called The Validity of the Executive Functioning Theory of Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, a meta-analytic review, aka a paper that looks at a bunch of papers and quite a good way to get really good research. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to, pretty much what it says on the tin, they wanted to figure out if executive function, if the theory that executive functioning is related to ADHD is valid. So how did they do this, Sarah?
Okay. So this meta-analysis included 83 studies. The sample size population, they looked at just under 4,000 people with ADHD. Their sample also included about 3,000 without ADHD, for control reasons. But essentially, since this is a meta-analysis, they basically just compiled these studies going back. They tried to go back as far as they could. So they started at 1980, and then obviously they stopped somewhere around 2000, 2005, which is quite old.
Yeah, it's before I was born.
Yeah, totally. I just wanted to point out, because when I was reading the body of this text, it says that at the time of this publishing, it was an updated meta-analysis of all the new literature that had just come out. Okay, so at the time, this was it. I just wanted to point that out.
That's crazy. 83 studies.
Yeah, if I look in the body, it said that 10 years prior, a study had been posted that only included 20 studies.
Wow. It is crazy how far we've come.
I wonder if that lines up with any DSM text revisions or anything like that, but that's
Probably does, yeah.
not a conversation that we need to have. Anyway, so there's a lot in here, obviously, since this is a meta-analysis and they're trying to establish like the everything about everything. So we're going to skip a little bit of what we know a lot about.
Yeah. But obviously it's in the show notes. So if you guys want to nerd out fully, you can do that.
Yes, I highly encourage you to always go and look at these things for the purposes of this conversation. Essentially, they showed that people with ADHD had executive functioning impairment in various tasks like response inhibition, like reacting instead of responding, struggles with working memory, struggles with planning. Yeah, we know all that. One thing that this paper did teach me, I think, for the first time was that the research is suggesting that executive functioning deficits are common, but not universal to ADHD experience. Their specific wording is that while executive functioning deficits are significant, they are neither necessary nor sufficient to cause ADHD in all cases.
Yeah, that's crazy. It is something I really wasn't, because when we got diagnosed, somebody else was holding the sheet of paper. They weren't taking me through, well, like this is this is how I diagnose you, and this was the process. So I thought executive functioning was a part of ADHD. I was really surprised, both back in 2005 and then in the latest issue of the DSM, to find that that's not the case.
I thought it was the whole thing. I mean, in my brain, ADHD is like a learning disability that kids have. So, like, it must be just purely this executive functioning stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess.
But it's not. Like, if you are somebody who has ADHD and you do not have executive functioning struggles, just tell us. Like, just send us an email. I'd love to know what it is like to not struggle with it, because to be honest, like as part of joining like our coaching program, we do a qualifying process. And one of the questions I ask is basically, what is the executive functioning struggle that you have? Because that's the support that we provide. So it's interesting to me that there are people out there who they just need help with the inattention, basically.
I have follow-up questions for you. Yeah.
What is your brain like? In some ways, it's like this brilliant reminder of the fact that our brains are all so different, and we don't always know what's going on inside someone else's brain.
Yeah, the next paper goes a little bit into why some of that might be happening. So again, spoilers, but yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
This meta-analysis also showed that executive functioning deficits were similar across all the subtypes. So that didn't really come into play here, but yeah, really the bottom line that they were trying to show is that executive functioning is not the full picture of ADHD, but also that some of these constructs and measures might be needing a little bit more attention, a little bit more cementing, better conceptualization and yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sure they probably thought to themselves, well, it's 2005, it's the beginning of the millennium. I'm sure by the time we get to like 2020 or something like that, we will have totally figured out what executive functioning is and how it works. And we did not. We absolutely have not.
Well, actually, the next installment of our episode does bring us to 2020.
Oh, that's so funny. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, the next paper that we talk about. And it said that it's the first paper that they know of that talks about this topic. So yeah, really excited. It took them 15 years to get there.
Yeah, definitely. And also shout out to Sarah for finding this paper, because I know that for a while you were like, oh, I really want the full text of this paper, and you got it. So that's good.
Shout out to Taylor. Yeah, she was able to like scour and get it for me. So yes.
Awesome. So this paper, this manuscript is called Executive Functioning Rating Scales, Ecologically Valid or Construct Invalid, which means it's a methodology paper, which I love. And basically, it's funded by the National Institutes of Health. It's from the American Psychological Association, which is a well-known organization, and it is from 2020. And basically what they were trying to do is exactly, again, what they were trying to do. So they were trying to figure out if executive functionings are commonly measured using different rating scales and different performance tests. Is there validity there? Like, what is going on? And they wanted to, I guess, make something like that. Sarah, do you want to take us through what they were doing?
Yeah, definitely. They basically wanted to look at a bunch of different executive functioning tests and questionnaires and things like that and put them up against each other.
Mm-hmm.
So usually when we're using these executive functioning tasks or whatever, we're comparing them to other variables like ADHD symptomology, severity, or, quality of life index or health outcomes, whatever. But here they're like pitting them against each other. So that's basically what this paper is about. They really set out to be like, executive functioning, is it a thing for real, or
2020, like 15 years later, they're like, okay, guys, we have to figure out if this is actually a thing. Like, it's in the DSM, it's at the bottom. Like, yeah, it still blows my mind. I struggle with working memory. Like, so many of the workbooks, if you ever want a workbook from us, by the way, just message me and I'll send you one. But like, so many of the workbooks are like how to deal with this executive functioning problem. It still blows my mind that we're having this conversation in 2020. Hey, you listening to this podcast. If you like what we do and you want to hear more of it, there is one way to make sure that happens. Please go ahead, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review. We have been told 5-star reviews can help us to get seen by more people, which means more people are going to learn about ADHD strategies.
Just press the button. Just give us a 5-star review. I will scroll down to the method section so that we could actually talk about this paper, because the sample size is pretty small. It's 136 children, 8 to 13 years old. So again, really narrow sample, primarily boys. So they got 42 with ADHD. And then they have 44 with like ADHD and comorbidities, things like anxiety, depression, autism. And then they looked at sort of other groups. They had 23 neurotypicals. Oh, and then they looked at some of those comorbidities again, but without the presence of the ADHD. So just anxiety, just depression, that sort of thing. So that's how they grouped the children, trying to compare their performance on the executive functioning tasks and all that.
Right. But like you said, not heaps of kids. So what were the tests that they did?
Yeah.
I'm guessing there are a lot.
I think, so many. I think, again, if you want to geek out, the full text of this is not available. But I wonder, maybe in the show notes, I can actually just put like a bunch of them. But some of them were like the stop signal task. Basically, these are things measuring like your response time, your response inhibition. Like, are you giving the correct response that we asked for, even when presented with distracting stimuli, that sort of thing. But then they also gave them like executive functioning scales and questionnaires. There's a couple of different types of those that they measured against each other. And their final sort of variable is academic achievement. So they got these kids' grades and then they gave them performance tests, essentially.
Yeah, definitely. And I see here you said 1 to 2 sessions of 3-hour testing blocks. What was that?
Yeah, I mean, it was them performing trials of these executive functioning tasks, doing these scales. It said that they would get little breaks after each task, and then after a certain number of series, they would get larger breaks. So it sounds like they at least tried to take into account how terrible it is to be a child and be tested for 3 hours.
These poor kids. I mean, they really put themselves on the line to get these results. So what did they find after putting these kids through all these different tests?
So I think I'm just going to go for the mic drop and say a direct quote from the paper. Their findings replicate prior evidence that executive functioning tests and rating scales cannot be used interchangeably as executive function measures.
Oh, well, this changes a lot of the research we've been looking at.
Yeah. So what this means in other language is that saying an executive functioning scale and an executive functioning task are measuring the same thing is incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
The stop
Mm-hmm.
signal task, your response inhibition, is going
Mm-hmm.
to predict different
Mm-hmm.
than an executive functioning questionnaire because it's measuring something different.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so simple, but we missed it.
A lot of people did. They didn't talk about it for 15 years. So
It's all on me, Skye.
But that's really interesting because
Yeah.
this is kind of like when we had that conversation about the different ways ADHD was being diagnosed. It's really tricky, you know, the more we do this, we've been doing it for over a year now. The more we do these kinds of things, the more it's like you just learn how complicated everything is and how difficult it is to get an accurate measure of something, especially something that's going on inside your brain.
Especially something that we don't even have an agreed upon definition for.
Yes, exactly.
You can't see my face, but it's like that emoji with all the teeth. Like, ooh.
Well, actually, I wanted to do that because I did jump on like Wikipedia of all places. I know this is very different, but just to look at all the different conversations people were having about things like executive functioning. And it's a long thing. Like, it's not just for ADHD. There's other clinical populations that have their own definitions of executive functioning. There's different ways to treat it. There's different ways to think about it. There's like a ton of different like theories of executive functioning. And you can sort of see why when they looked at all of this, that the people who were writing the DSM and doing the diagnostic process just went, you know what, we're just going to footnote it. I think we're going to stick with things we can observe, like your impulsivity and your inattention.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too far away from that paper before I say that some of those measures, those executive functioning measures, were a good predictor of academic success.
Mm-mm.
You know,
Yeah.
so performing well on some of these executive functioning tasks is indicative of academic success. But as the first paper suggested, like there's more than just executive dysfunction going on with the ADHD thing. And maybe we need to be also supporting that other stuff.
Yeah.
I think we're calling it impulsivity right now.
Stay tuned. We'll tell you if the name changes. It is interesting, though. It's like, yeah, like you, I just didn't expect to have so much to cover. I mean, obviously, we know about the definitions and we've talked about it, but like, as part of writing the book and doing this podcast, it's been a real journey to go in depth into executive functioning and realize how much they don't know. And I think if I was to come up with not a silver lining exactly, but something for that, like one of the things I ended up writing about was just how much it's important to be able to understand that your own knowledge of your brain is super important. Like if you feel like something fits you or doesn't fit you, there's a lot of controversy. There's a lot of discussion about what executive functioning even is. So this might be something that we haven't even figured out yet that you're struggling with, that you find a way to support. And if that's safe and healthy and valid, then, that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, communication is such a big factor here because, again, we know that like neurotypicals and ADHDers are sort of communicating things differently. So even when we're trying to explain to our professionals sort of some of these things, they're not used to hearing about it in that way, or they can't relate to the information in that way. We're not using their language. But when we use their language, sometimes they're like, "Are you just Googling?" And so anyway, it gets a little complicated, but there's definitely something to be said about how complex our worldview is as neurodivergents and how important it is that we're seeking support from people who can be just as complex.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so you had a couple of like key similarities and shared themes here as well, Sarah. Do you want to take us through some of those?
The main thing that really ties both of these papers together is obviously that heavy focus on the executive function theory with ADHD. Both papers are really trying to explain like what executive function is, what is the role within ADHD. But while like the older paper really talks about what executive functioning is, the newer paper is focused more on clarifying the construct.
Yeah.
Yeah, really pitting them against each other again, which is something that the first paper suggested that they do. So I thought it was such a cool loop to close. Anyway.
Yeah. No, 100%. You know, like letters to each other from 15 years later. I think it's super cool. And each paper sort of talked about this idea that basically that there's more complexity, you know, this idea of like, rather than a single, like, this is what executive functioning is, we need something that's more of a multifactorial model. And I mean, I think that's true. I also think that's super complicated. If I drew that out on a piece of paper, just even for the people I know, it would be a lot of different pieces going in different directions.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it this way, they're struggling to correctly measure executive functioning now as a single factorial.
Yeah.
And then we're going to add a whole nother thing that they don't really understand yet. So it's like, whew, it might be another 20 years.
Yeah. Well, you can sort of see why the DSM just has a section called associated features, and they don't really include that in like the diagnostic process, but they're just footnoting it. And because there's so much to neurodiversity and ADHD in this way, I think there is this growing, developing understanding of what it is and what it relates to and how we think differently and how we think the same. And honestly, I have to say it's really exciting to be making a podcast talking about research right now, because I've heard other people talk about this idea of like, oh, well, everyone runs out of things to talk about. I'm just putting it out there. I don't think we're going to run out of things to talk about.
This feels like a current events podcast, honestly. Yeah. It's like constantly we're like, breaking news.
Somebody's decided this isn't relevant anymore, or the opposite. Yeah.
Hey, did you know we've always doubted this thing?
Yeah, exactly. It's crazy. It is interesting. I do, like, when we started this, you know, I wanted to share like this idea, and it is very much, I think, because stuff in your brain, like right back when I was studying neuroscience in university, they said that anything that was 2 years old was out of date and super probably different. And that, you know, they thought it was sort of the last frontier. It was like this whole world that we hadn't mapped and we didn't understand. And ADHD is happening in your brain. So I feel like it's kind of coming along for that ride. I see you wanted to say something nerdy.
Yeah, I don't want to open a whole can of worms here, but the whole genetics thing is showing us that maybe it's not just the brain, right? Like the autonomic nervous system conversation started to show us that actually a lot of stuff might be originating or like hubbing, like, you know, the brain is like the hub, like the message center, but there's a lot happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so fascinating.
It's so fascinating. And thank you for being here, you know, listener, along for the ride with us, because we're just going to keep going. We're just going to keep diving in, keep pulling it out, keep trying to find people who could tell us what is going on in our brains.
Any skills for this one?
Any skills? Oh, that's a good question. Honestly, I think the skill would be like analysis of your own self. Like, just think about yourself and how you work. If you want, I've got a link at the bottom in the show notes to a book that I'm writing on focus balance days. And I talk about this idea of like people like looking at an elephant from different perspectives, seeing different things. You know, maybe they'll see the ears or the nose more. But if you are that elephant, you're the person who has the ADHD brain, sort of becoming aware of like, how am I showing up? Like, what is that strange thing that I sort of just assume is like a personal failing? Maybe it's a neurodiverse difference.
I am super aware of how differently some people see me compared to others.
Yeah.
Like, to some people, I am wonderful and I am kind and I am caring and I am compassionate. And then to other people, they would not say those things about me. And you know what? That's not all on me, right? But it is. It just shows like that perspective, that perception, like, and it can't even be on you. And you are going to be aware of it sometimes.
Yeah. Exactly. So it's sort of being aware of like how you're being perceived, but then also being aware of how you are coming up in your brain. Because, there's a world where people could just cut executive functioning out of the whole system. They could be like, well, maybe it's related, maybe it's not. It's too complicated to figure it out, so we're just going to cut it. But for a lot of people,
we don't all struggle with it, so it must not really be an ADHD
it's not really
thing.
a thing, yeah. But for those of us who do struggle with it and for whom the strategies and things are really, really helpful, yeah, just being aware of like, no, this is a struggle that I have and I'm using executive functioning supports and it is helping. That is true. And just continuing to experiment and test and find what works for you and try and, feel comfortable in doing things differently because those different things are working for you. That would be my advice.
Lean heavily on the scientific method.
And try things out.
Yeah.
Do both. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, guys, and we will see you next time. Thank you for listening, everyone, and a big thank you to Adam for making us sound great and Anastasia for making us look great. We couldn't do it without you.
And if you're looking for any of the references to the papers that we discussed, head on over to our show notes page because I always bring the receipts.
Plus, if you want to find out more about us or any more deep diving into what we're doing, you can find us on Substack. That's where the community is. That's where we're chatting. And you can see all of the fun and exciting things that we are bringing to the table.
Thanks for being here.